students. Welcome, Hoshamdeed and Hosh Galdinas. Today we are going to discuss the most important literary figure of Puritan age, who is John Milton. We are going to discuss John Milton's poetry, his important literary works, and then his style of writing, as well as the dominant themes of his poetry. So let's start our discussion. John Milton was born on December 9th, 1608, and about 8 years before Shakespeare's death. He did his BA from Christ College, Cambridge in 1629, and Milton was a very profound scholar of classical Greek philosophy. So the whole early phase of his poetry is dominated by his inspiration for the classical Greek mythology and classical Greek mythological figures, as well as classical Greek philosophies. The young Milton was first intended to join church, but when he found the corrupt state of the Church of London of England, then he gave up this idea of entering into the church, and he just started focusing on more on becoming a poet. In order to become a successful poet, in order to make himself meditate on his poetic ventures, on his poetic vocations, he retired to his residence at Horton, and he just secluded himself and he started living a very secluded life in deep study and in meditation for approximately 7 years. And this was the time period he wrote 4 poems, and those 4 poems are the remarkable early poems of John Milton. These poems include El Allegro, Il Penseroso, Camus, and Lycidas. These poems can be considered the early blossoms of Milton's poetic genius. When we discuss the very themes of El Allegro and Il Penseroso, these poems are 2 distinguished moods of a poet. Rather, we can say that these poems reflect 2 different moods of the poet. In one poem, and these very poems, they are also very much autobiographical from the point of view of Milton's temperament, because El Allegro and Il Penseroso, they describe the state of mind of a poet, or the state of mind of a person, the happy state of mind of the poet and of the person, and the settings in that poems are quite gay and bright. And on the other hand, in Il Penseroso, there is sadness, gloom. On the other hand, it carries the contemplation. Means one poem carries the contemplation on happy mood, on brightness, on vivid activities of life, and on the other hand, the other poem shows the gloom and very depth and pathos. And that's why we can say that both of these poems reflect 2 different sides of human nature, 2 different sides of human temperament: the happy side, the gay and bright side, and the sad and gloomy side. Both of these poems are also inspired of Milton's knowledge of Greek and mythology, because in both of these poems we find his vivid use of the humanistic images and the mythological images. So not only in both of these poems, in almost all the early poems of John Milton, we find the very depiction of Renaissanceian spirit. That's why he's also known as the last child of Renaissance. And He was also a classical Greek scholar and a humanist, and all these humanistic and Renaissance spirits are depicted in the early poems of John Milton. And this El Allegro and Il Penseroso, they fall into the category of those early poems. Then comes Lycidas. This is a kind of classical pastoral elegy, and it is very much like Spenser's Astrophel. And Milton, wrote this very poem on the death of Edward King, who was Milton's friend at college. And it was written in a conventional classical style, and it is a wonderful example of classical pastoral elegy. Its contents are stuffed with the moral zeal of Puritans as well. This is another feature of this very poem. The next poem, Comus, it it shows a diversion, a distinction, a diversion in Milton's mind, and that diversion was from the humanistic and Renaissance and the classical Greek philosophies to the puritanic zest, to the puritanic zeal. So, this very poem, Comus, carries both of the elements of the Renaissance elements, the humanistic elements, as well as the puritanic elements. And all these four poems, they fall into the category of the early poems, the early poetry written by John Milton. In 1638, Milton decided a continental tour, and he remained on a visit for approximately about 15 months. And when he returned to England, that was the time period when there was violent civil war in England. And Milton decided to become the part of that civil war because due to his humanistic spirit, he could not he could feel the pain of the people, he could feel the pain of the citizens of England on that time, and he started fighting for their liberty, and he started fighting for the liberty of his own home, of his own people. He took an active part in the riots, but his pen was more active. During this time period, Milton also got married, but that was a very unfortunate marriage, and that was a very unhappy marriage, and that was ended on divorce. And after this divorce, Milton wrote some prose, and that prose was in the form of two pamphlets he wrote on divorce, and those very prosaic pamphlets on divorce, they were written in the backdrop of his own first divorce. In 1649, when the Commonwealth government established, Milton became the secretary, the Latin secretary of Oliver Cromwell. He was also a fast friend of Oliver Cromwell. In 1653, there was a time period that was a very unfortunate time period for John Milton, because he went totally blind due to his excessive hard work, struggle, and study. And this was the time period of Milton in which his soul just awakened. And during this very time, he wrote very soulful sonnets, and that were emotional and somehow heartbroken as well. But those sonnets also carry the very bent of his Puritanism, as the Puritanic zeal is evident in all those poems, those sonnets particularly. This period extended from 1640 to till the restoration of Charles II in 1660. And as we all know that in 1660 the monarchy was restored in England. Now all the hopes of John Milton were just shattered, and he was like a broken-hearted person on that time. And this was the time period when we find the very masterpieces of John Milton, because on one hand he is a heartbroken person, he's a blind person, and on the other hand we have the very remarkable pieces of writing like Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agonistes. These are the remarkable poems of John Milton, and these are the poems that were actually written during his time of blindness. From the literary viewpoint, actually we can say that this was the glorious period of his life, and he started writing and contemplating on immortal productions, rather immortality, and those very items, literary items that were written during that time period, those were the immortal productions of his poetic genius. Let's discuss Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost is an immense epic that is consisted of 12 books, and this is an excellent example of classical epics, because in this very epic, as we all know that an epic poem is a long narrative poem with a dignified theme, with lucid language, so all these things, they are applicable on this very epic Paradise Lost. It has a very remarkable subject matter, it has lucid language, it has elevated theme, it has supernatural characters like Saturn, God, Adam and Eve are the characters of Paradise Lost. And secondly, the most important thing is that in this very poem Paradise Lost, again we find Milton's inspiration, and Milton singing the slogan of or chanting the slogan of Puritanism. Side by side, we can also find the element of humanism in this very poem. When we consider this poem from the perspective, as Milton said, that he wrote that poem on that time to justify the ways of God to men. But on the other hand, if we analyze the characters, the very rebellious characters of this very poem, like Saturn and the dialogues of Saturn, if we analyze the dialogues of Saturn, they are extremely remarkable, and they are so full of the humanistic zest. So from those very dialogues, we can find the spirit of Renaissance and the spirit of humanism in John Milton's poem and in John Milton's poetry. Milton's finest poetry was written when he was blind and when he was suffering. And his noblest and finest works like Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, Samson Agonistes were also written during that very time period. We have been discussed and the scenario of the basic scenario of Paradise Lost. It was written on man's first disobedience, and it is based on the story of Adam and Eve and fall of man from the Garden of Eden, and then it is based on the story of how Satan planned revenge, and he got succeeded in his attempt of taking that revenge, and then Adam and Eve, they were banished by God, and that was the result of Satan's revenge, because he made Adam and Eve to rather better to say he had made Eve to eat the fruit of the forbidden tree, and then Adam had also eaten that very fruit, and both of them, they had to leave the Garden of Eden in result of this disobedience. So this is a very remarkable piece, and I think a separate session is needed to celebrate and to explain the subject matter of Paradise Lost and the versification and rich imagery of John Milton used in Paradise Lost. We will try to have a separate discussion or a separate session on the Paradise Lost. But if we talk about the versification, it is remarkable, it is excellent. And on the other hand, if we talk about the imagery, then we just something this just make us shocked that all that imagery was written or created or depicted by a person who was actually blind. And that was perhaps that's the reason behind the use of dark imagery in the entire scenario of the poem Paradise Lost. But the imagery is remarkable, as well as the versification is remarkable. Almost on all the grounds, we can admire Paradise Lost. We can admire it if we analyze it with a puritanic spirit, and we can also appreciate it if we analyze it from the Renaissance and humanistic spirits. Another very important thing regarding Paradise Lost is that Paradise Lost has perfect unity of action, and in its nature it is very much near to the greatest classical epics of the history of Europe that were written by Homer and Virgil. And Paradise Lost is so full of classical allusions, and it also contains similes like Homeric epics, and the very epic shows the zeal of Milton's classical learning. When we talk about the style of Paradise Lost, then we also find it a remarkable poem, because both in the loftiness of its theme and in the grandeur of its style, that is a wonderful poem. According to Arnold, there is no match of Milton's style, grandeur, sureness, and perfection of lyric in terms of Paradise Lost. After that, Milton wrote Paradise Regained, and we can take Paradise Regained as a sequel to the Paradise Lost, but that very poem, Paradise Regained, couldn't get that much fame as compared to the Paradise Lost. Then this very poem, Paradise Regained, it opens with the Christ's journey into the wilderness after he got baptized. And this very poem uh, is consisted of 4 books, and it describes the temptation of Christ by Satan, and hence it also answers the victory of the Redeemer. It is written in a Solomon tone, and that's why it also looks beautiful and grand in its style, but not up to the level of Paradise Lost. Perhaps Milton's genius was also growing old with the passage of time, but it was also Solomon, it was also grand, but it wasn't up to the level of Paradise Lost. Then another poem, that was Samson Agonistes, that was written on that time. It's a sort of a choral drama, and it is based on the Greek models, and it has a threefold unity of time, place, and action. That's why the very piece has won the the celebration, just like the Elizabethan tragedies, because it has the very features of Elizabethan tragedies in this very poem, Samson Agonistes. And it shows, actually, when we talk about the time period it was written, it actually shows the fall of the Puritanic paradigm. Let's talk about the prominent features of Miltonic poetry. I like to start my argument with a remark of W. H. Hudson. W. H. Hudson says, that in him we have a wonderful union of intellectual power and creative power, both at their highest. He is also a consummate literary artist whose touch is as sure in delicate details as in vast uh, general effects. The very conception of Miltonic poetry is lofty. The loftiness is the very prime feature of John Milton's poetry, because his style is very lofty, because in his poems he like in his some of the remarkable poems, he uses the tradition of the invocation of muses, and he has taken this very thing from the religious theology, from divine and really religious theology. So this invocation of muses, in fact, makes his work very lofty and very elevated. The second important feature of John Milton's poetry is sublimity. Milton's poetry is very supreme, sublime, and majestic in its nature, in its style, as well as in its versification. It is the expression of a very pure and a very noble mind, a mind that is enriched by the knowledge and by the knowledge of art. Um, his poetry has a very elevating influence on the mind or minds of readers, means that the very element of sublimity can be traced from the effects of Miltonic poetry that it makes on the minds of the readers, that right at the moment the very poem reaches to its climax, the reader feels himself or herself fully ecstatic, and this is the time when we feel the very element of the aesthetics of Miltonic poetry. And this influence is exercised not only by the lofty and elevated thoughts of John Milton, but also the writing style that is so full of grandeur and accuracy. Milton, another very prime feature of Miltonic poetry is Milton's love of beauty. This very thing, love of beauty, again is a feature that shows his inspiration from classical Greek myths and classical Greek philosophy. Milton was possessed with a deep sense of beauty, and the very sense of beauty is depicted in El Allegro, Il Penseroso, in Comus, and in Lycidas. Not only in these poems, because they belong to the early phase of Milton's poetry, and on that time, Milton's mind was fully occupied by his inspiration for the classical Greek myths and classical Greek philosophies. But in the later poems, in the Paradise Lost and in the Paradise Regained, again we can find the element of beauty in the form of the loftiness of his style, and in the form of the elevated language he uses in those poems, and then in the way of his representation that is so grand, and then from his subject matter, and then from his use of rich imagery, we can find the very element of beauty in all those things. So overall, the whole lot of Miltonic poetry shows his bent of his love for beauty. The aesthetic side of Miltonic mind is also depicted by Milton's poetry in almost all of his poems, from the early phase till the later phase. If we talk about the effects of age on Milton's mind, then we can find two types of effects on his mind. On one hand, we can find the effects of an Renaissance spirit, the humanistic spirits that are depicted in his early as well as in his later poems, that as I have already been exemplified, that we find the very element of Puritanism and the very element of humanism and Renaissance in Paradise Lost, even. Then his versification is again very absolute and very dignified. But I think in terms of Miltonic poetry and the prominent features of Miltonic poetry and the major poems written by John Milton, our today's discussion is enough. Thank you so much for today. See you in some other session with some new topic. Till then, Allah Hafiz.